Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming. My name is John Crum. I'm a researcher in the Adaptive Systems and Interaction Group, and this is the session on how to give a great research talk. So I proposed this idea of having this session, and I was the only one audacious enough to say that I should be included in the list of people who are going to give a talk about how to give a great talk. So the others, Patrick Bowdish, Rick Zaleski, and Mary Cherwinski, I asked them to be part of this session because either I've heard them give great talks or I've heard that they actually do give great talks. So we're each going to go for about 10 minutes or so, giving our own version of what it's like to give a great talk. We know that everyone has a different style of speaking. So if just one person tells you how to give a great talk, your style might not really match theirs very well. So we hope that we have a kind of a broad spectrum of different styles here. So at least one of us maybe appeals to the way that you like to give a talk. So Dilbert says, I'd like to start with a cartoon. It's about a guy who shows a cartoon before giving a boring presentation, but it doesn't work because the cartoon has no punchline. Well, why is this so important to be able to give a good talk? Well, like it or not, people who speak well are considered smart and vice versa. And it's not really fair because you could be a smart person and not speak well or the other way around, but that's the impression that people are going to get if you don't speak well. Your most important talks are probably going to be at conferences, and a conference is a great way to get your name and face out in front of a lot of people, most of whom, like these people here, they're never going to read your paper, right? But this is a chance to show them how great you are. It's kind of your one good shot. Also, the other important talk you're going to give is your job talk. And so we have a lot of people coming through here interviewing for full-time positions. And if I'm on the interview loop, I always go to their talk, and I can usually tell after the talk whether or not I want to hire them or not hire them. I go through with the interview, and maybe we'll get some other things out of the interview, but I can usually tell after the talk if I think they're any good. The nice thing is you don't really need any natural talent to give a good talk. You just have to follow some rules and practice, and you can give a good talk. So here's the outline. I'm going to talk about what to say, how to say it well, what to show, how to be a session chair, and how to end your talk. So what to say? The main part of your talk is probably going to be explaining the technology of whatever research you've done. But before you explain the technology, you have to do a couple things. You have to explain why this is an important problem, which often comes down to just saying what are the applications of what you're working on. Otherwise, throughout your talk, your audience is going to be distracted by trying to think, well, this seems neat, but why would I ever want to do it? So you have to explain that up front, and you have to explain why your solution is better, or at least different than other solutions out there. I know when I wrote my very first technical paper, I gave it to my graduate advisor, and I left these things out. And he said, you have to explain why it's important and why it's better. And I thought, that's just a bunch of weasel words, and anyone who really knows this technology is going to read my paper or hear my talk and understand why this is an important thing to be working on. But that's not true. Most people don't know enough to know why it's important. And then when you get to talking about the technology, your goal is to convince the audience that you've got something really nice. Your goal is not to teach the audience how to implement it. Teaching them how to implement it would be a pretty boring talk, and you'd rather use your time to convince them that you've really got something worth thinking about. And you've really achieved success if you actually get them to go back and read your paper to get the details. More on what to say. Shorter is better. If you talk on and on, you're going to irritate their audience, and they're going to go away with a bad feeling about what you talked about, even if what you talked about was good. Job candidates, when they come here, seem especially prone to going too long. And you can understand why. They really want the job, and they want to dump out everything that they've done, so hopefully we'll be impressed by something that they did. But sitting in the audience are going to be the people that are going to interview you later on. And if you irritate them, that's really a bad way to start. Stories get attention. It's really nice to tell a story every so often. So here's my story. I'm going to talk about eye contact a little later. And so I was sitting in a talk next door. I think it's the conference room right over there. It's a little smaller one. And I was really interested in this technology that the speaker was going to talk about, so I sat in the front row. And some other people dribbled in, and there were maybe like 5 people that were sitting in rows behind me during the talk. And I noticed that toward the end of this talk, the speaker had really good eye contact. He was really drilling in on me. And I thought, man, this guy's really good. I'm really enjoying his eye contact. And then when he got to the end, I raised my hand, I had a question, and he called on me, and I asked the question, and then he answered it. And then I looked around the room, and during the talk, everyone else but me and the host and the speaker had left the room sometime during the talk. So, so now I know, 2 things. Why he had such good eye contact, because I was basically the only one who came to listen to his talk, and I realized I probably didn't need to raise my hand to ask this question. I could have just shouted it out, and he would have paid attention to me. But stories really get attention if you can throw in a story during your talk. About putting math on your slides, I recommend against trying to tell your whole story just by building up equations as you go along. It's so easy to lose people with equations that by the end of your talk, you're not going to have very many people following what you say. A few are okay, but don't be gratuitous about it. Don't put this equation for the normal distribution in your talk. Everyone knows it, and if you put it in there, I'm just going to think you're trying to impress me with your equations, and you won't be. I like to flash up some math just to show that I have it. I don't like to go through all my equations, but I might say, here's a bunch of equations that we use for this. We put them together with Bayes' rule, or whatever we did, just to show that there's a principled approach to what I did. How to say what you're talking about well. The most important piece of advice I have to giving a good talk is to practice it beforehand. I practiced this talk probably 6 times before I gave it, yesterday and today. And it might not be so good now, but you should have heard it the first time I went through it. It was terrible, and it was too long. I had to cut out slides. But practicing really makes it a lot better. I've got a friend who says that he'll give his talk once or twice to the bed in his hotel room before he goes down and gives the talk at the conference. And of course, you should time yourself while you're practicing too. When you're speaking, you have to compensate for distractions. Sitting out in the audience, we've all done this. You check your email if it's a boring talk, or your mind wanders and things like that. So you might lose the logical sequence of points that the speaker is trying to make. And so it's the speaker's responsibility to try to get you on track. To every once in a while say, remember what we're doing, we're trying to compute these probabilities on a map, and that'll get everyone back on track whose mind may have wandered. And so it's okay to repeat those things from time to time. And then eye contact. I don't think drilling in is so important, but you should at least look at your audience occasionally so they know that you know that they're there. What to show? I like to put a picture on every slide, and I think a lot of good speakers do this. If I can't find one that comes from my paper or from the actual research, I'll just go to some search site and pick out a picture that looks vaguely appropriate for the slide. Demos in your talk are really awesome. I wrote a demo for one of my talks where it did a reverse white pages lookup and gave the name and address of every person who lived in a circle I clicked on. But I wrote that program just to show during talks. I did another demo where at the beginning of my talk I gave a URL for people to download a program that would tell who was in physical proximity to them based on Wi-Fi signal strengths. And by the end of my talk, a bunch of people in the audience had downloaded that program, and then we all ran it at the end, and then they all got a list of people who were sitting close to them in the audience. Rick Salisky does a really nice photosynth demo in his talks. When Paul Viola came here for his job talk, it was in this room, he set up a camera, and it was so it had live video, and it was doing face detection. He held up a dollar bill in front of it, and it could detect the face on the dollar bill. So that was just really memorable. This is back to putting a picture in every slide. This is just one example. I was talking about previous work in this talk. So I had list the previous work, but I decided to try to come up with some kind of appropriate pictures for each piece of previous work. So this work was from Cambridge University, so I had a picture of Cambridge there. A couple things from Microsoft, so I had just pictures of rich people over here. Work from Intel Research Seattle, so I had a Seattle picture, and then from Finland had the people doing what they always do in Finland, sitting in a sauna. I like to put cartoons in my talk, and actually I have this book of cartoons. When I find one that's I think good, I cut it out and put it in here, and then I scan it in to put it on one of my slides. I gave a talk once where I put an ad at the bottom of every slide just to be funny. It was an ad for some different company, and then I had another talk where I had these email pop-ups that would pop up on some of the slides and just talk about embarrassing things. So how to be a session chair? At some point, if you haven't already, you'll be asked to be a session chair at a conference. So you've got some jobs to do as a session chair. Of course, your job is to make sure that the speakers are there and have their slides and the computer to show them on. You have to introduce each speaker. AJ Brush in Microsoft Research has this nice thing where she'll get a fun fact from every speaker, like their favorite thing to eat for breakfast, and then she includes that when she introduces the speakers. I think that's kind of cool. Keep them on time. Hold up the timing slide so people know how much time they have left. I think one of the most important things is to have a question ready. As a speaker, it's kind of embarrassing when you get to the end of your talk and it's time for questions and the audience is just silent and you wonder, boy, did they understand it at all? And it's really nice if the session chair can jump in at that point with a question. It's happened to me more than once as a session chair that I've asked a question when no one in the audience had one. By the time the speaker got done answering my question, someone in the audience had thought of some questions to ask. So people sometimes just need a little bit of time to come up with something to ask. And then, of course, your job is to lead the applause. When the speaker's done, you start everyone clapping. And when the speaker's done answering questions, it's kind of silly, but we always clap again, right? I cringe when the session chair says, let's thank our speaker. It's enough just to say thank you and start clapping, and everyone else will join in. They want to clap. Then finally, how to end. You have to indicate when you're done with your talk, and I tend to make it really kind of explicit. I say, that's the end, thanks for listening. Let the session chair ask for questions, and it's good to end on a memorable slide. I'll just read this cartoon here. This concludes my 2-hour presentations. Any questions? Did you intend the presentation to be incomprehensible, or do you have some sort of rare PowerPoint disability? Are there any questions about the content? There was content? And so this is my last slide, and this is just an example of ending on a slide that's memorable. So I would end my talk, and this kind of summarized all the things that I had talked about. So now when I'm interacting with the audience in questions, if the audience member doesn't really care about what the question is, they've got something to look at that kind of reminds them of what I talked about. Let's see. So, taking my own advice, I'll say that's the end, and thanks for listening. Okay. Let me just go back here, and I'm going to be the session chair now too. And we're going to go in reverse order here. So next to speak is Patrick Bowdish. He's a researcher in the Adaptive Systems Interaction Focus Group.
Do you want to take questions right now?
Are there any questions? There's one.
I imagine you change how much humor you include depending on where you're giving a talk.
I do. Yep. It depends on how much I think the audience is interested in what I'm talking about, and of course how much time I have and how much I think they'll understand. So yeah, definitely change it.
For something like the running gags along the footer of the slides, it seems like that might not be appropriate for a job talk, for example.
Yeah.
Or maybe not for a conference.
I agree. It's not appropriate for a small audience either, because when a gag comes up, it's kind of like you've got an expectation for people to laugh at it, and if it's a small audience, if no one finds it funny, then it's just kind of embarrassing when there's just silence there. So I wouldn't do that with a group of 20 or less, probably. Okay. So,
cool.
Thanks. Patrick.
Am I on? I hope I am. Okay, well, thanks so much. I looked at John's deck, which I liked very much, and so instead of repeating a lot of things, I just thought I'd pick a specific topic to talk about. I totally agree with everything that John said, and instead what I'll do is I'll just dive into one specific topic, which is visuals. So I've got a fairly extreme style of doing slides. It doesn't mean that this is the only way to go, but I thought it might provoke some thought. The first thing that's important to me is show, don't tell, and the second one is how to focus people's attention. And already disregarding one of John's recommendations of testing my talk and practicing, I did not test, I did not practice because I didn't look at it until yesterday. Instead, I just brought 2 different decks, and I just run through these, and I thought I'd just comment on the things I was thinking when I made this deck. So the first one is to talk about phosphor, which is about afterglow effects and user interfaces, and I'm following John's advice here. I just went to an image search program and found some sort of titles that I thought was related. I always start my presentations with a demo. If I don't have a demo, then at least a piece of video, and if I don't have video, at least with a picture. But if I can, I give a demo. Many people think that you can't appreciate a demo until you've understood why and what this whole thing is about. I tend to disagree with that. I think it's okay to show a demo at the get-go. If people don't understand it, just show the demo again later in your talk. Just give a 30-second demo, which I won't in this case. Normally I would click and I would show this, bring up this interface, and I move a couple of sliders around, and you see how they leave afterglow effects. And when I'm done with this demo, people have a rough idea what's going on, and they can put the rest of the talk into perspective. I tend to start with an example of things and generalize, unlike other speakers who tend to start with a theory, and at the end they start to give an example, which I used to do when I was a grad student, but didn't work so well. So in the beginning, I tend to give a quick walkthrough of the whole talk. So I give the demo of a couple of controls, the afterglow effects. I say, well, in this talk I'll present how to make a complete visual language out of this. And then at the end, I'll present a user study in which I present that we found significant performance benefits. And I actually show this slide at the end, and people who can really quickly, they can see that we had about 20% performance benefits in terms of task time. But I will not stop to actually explain, at this point what these things are, because this is all just a preview of what comes later. So I tend not to say, well, I will present this and I will show you that. I just show you what I have and I'll show it again later. And it turns out people tend to memorize that a little better this way. Okay, so I'll just run through these slides. I did not have the time to actually edit and cut. So I use a lot of full screen images where I just show examples of scenarios. Sometimes so here's, scenario motivation from expose. Sometimes I tease people a little bit. And animation forces users to wait. I use animation really sparingly unless I can really use it to connect to something that happens in the deck. So if this talk is about animation, then I will animate. If something is about something happening slowly or moving in, then I will use animation. But I tend to avoid transitions between slide decks. I agree with John. It's always a good idea to have some sort of visuals on the deck. It's okay to have them redundant. And my goal eventually is to get to use as little text as possible. Please, Michael.
Well, that was actually going to be my question. How do you choose what text to put on here? You have a lot of images and everything. You have maybe half of a sentence per slide.
Absolutely. So the main, and I'll get back to this later, the main theme for me is typically text and visuals collide in some sort of way. Let me rephrase. Text and text collides with each other. Images and text is fine. Since I'm talking when I'm giving the presentation, my goal would be ultimately not to have any text at all. It turns out, and I've seen people who did that, not so much in CS, but in architecture and design. People just, sometimes even the hardcore guys, they bring a slide deck, meaning a bunch of slides and a slide projector, and they run through these slides and they just comment on things that you see in them. It turns out that reading and listening is really difficult. I think the main reason why many people have a lot of text in their slides, that would be speculation. I can tell you why I used to have a lot of text in my slides, and it was because I was deadly afraid of standing there and not remembering what to say. So I would end up putting all my text into the slides, and I would end up reading the slides, which is okay. Now that I've been in this business for a little longer, I feel like, well, if everything fails, I can still come up with some sort of a story of what I want to tell about this. Yes, I will typically, on average, forget to say 5 or 10%. Sometimes I sit down and I totally forgot to say this. But I'm kind of less afraid of just not knowing what to say. And so I tend to think of slides more as something that complements what I plan to say when the slide comes up, instead of being kind of redundant with what I am going to say. So in some cases, I tend to have very few bullet points. Here's one where I actually walk through the rationale and I use a little bit of that. I think it's completely, PowerPoint has a certain affordance. Tufty is the guy who always talks about this. If you edit your decks in PowerPoint, sometimes I've seen people who had 3 bullets on a slide, and I asked them later and they said, yeah, I actually had only 2 points, and the third one just, there was too much empty space on that slide. I think it's completely okay to have an empty slide. If you have one thing to say, this technique is susceptible to clutter, that's fine. There's no need to fill the whole slide with that. White space is beautiful. Related work, I used to have a slide that would list a bunch of authors and the years. So this is my current way of doing related work. It's kind of RSVP. I'm just showing pictures that I've extracted from their papers, and I go through them. And instead of having them all on one slide, I just go through them quickly. And it turns out by using all that space, people actually recognize and understand them much more quickly. This is about storyboards, Michael Haller about games, the Apex system by Steve Feiner, Lithium, and Manish, one of the authors, shows path of how, afterglow effects of how people walk around. Action Synopsis shows, picks good frames from animation. This is also a way of showing motion of objects. One thing in Kai, macOS, high-density cursor, telepointers. So this was kind of funny. I gave this talk at WIST, and the previous speaker in the session actually talked about a similar topic, so I took a picture of her as she was speaking and pasted that in the deck. So it's prior art, right? Anyway, so I spent 5 minutes on related work, but by actually using one slide for each one of them, typically people understand much faster what I'm trying to tell them because they recognize the images from having read the paper, and I find that works somewhat better than having one slide with a lot of bullet points on it. Okay. Here's a little bit of a visual trick. I tend to use a lot of photographs. Typically early in the project I run around with a camera, I take pictures. This is actually a picture I've taken off a book by Scott McCloud, and to make sure that the rest of the thing is not too distracting, I overlaid translucent things on these so that the thing I'm trying to show actually stands out, yet you can still see that this is taken out of a book. I tend to put a lot of time to diagrams.
What graphic program do you use? Like Photoshop and Illustrator?
Yeah, you'll be surprised. I use PowerPoint for most of these things, actually. A lot of stuff's done in PowerPoint. If I need something more whizzy, I spend a lot of time in Photoshop then at some point. But not on these. These are all done in PowerPoint, actually. PowerPoint is kind of, Illustrator is the next level up, I guess. Again, I tend to, in many ways what I do is I start my deck typically by taking all the figures from the paper. And if the figures in the paper are carefully done, then this is largely the talk in some sort of way. And I try to say the things that the paper says, some fraction thereof. But if the figures in the paper are well done, then they will already guide through the actual thing. Sometimes I need to change things that were a sequence of pictures in the paper, and I can go back to an animation to show what they do because now I have an interactive medium. And in many ways, I just tend to have a little bit of a label there. That's roughly it. Implementation, I just show pictures of the implementation. We've got a Delphi implementation. This is a Flash implementation I wrote. We ran 2 user studies. Instead of explaining what the task was, ideally I show a video of a person performing the task. Or I give a demo of what people did in the task. So that typically gives people a good idea if they want to believe me or not. This is a good stats slide because it's very selective, and this is a terrible stats slide because it's totally non-selective, and this is actually not a good one. Okay, let me quickly show the other deck I brought, and then if I can find it, there you go. Admittedly, the stuff I do is very visual. That makes this easier. So again, I start with a demo. I think here. Okay, I extract this, does not work. So in this case, you see me play a video game using this game controller I built called SOAP. And again, I'm not trying to explain all the wonderful things this can do. That's a 2D pointing device. All you see in the beginning is me performing a task, in this case playing a video game. And it gives you, in fact, as part of the fact that it doesn't work right now, it gives you an idea of how accurate this thing is and what you can do with it. It's obviously only a small fraction of what can be done, but you have some sort of an idea in your head of what this thing is good for. If I use graphics from the web, I tend to mat them, which means I tend to remove the white stuff around it, and then I can use them more freely, combine them. And I can do I can combine them in a way, they're kind of generic. It's a certain time investment at the beginning, but once I have it, it's easier to make new decks out of them. For prototyping, I tend to show versions of all prototypes. Sometimes I show a piece of video. To show how it underwent certain development cycles. Sometimes I highlight things in the deck. Animation can clarify what's going on. Examples of application scenarios. Again, these are, the whole image is black and white, and only the things I want you to look at I point out. Again, here, this is an interesting picture. I want you to look at this hand sanitizer bottle, so I used Photoshop to blur the rest of the picture so that you will focus on that hand sanitizer bottle. Again, I'm trying to remove everything that's not of interest in this example, and I used as many slides with pictures as I can and remove all the visuals, all the text. Okay. Okay. Let me go back to the main thing. So, just in summary, show, don't tell. For me personally, and I admit this is a very extreme style of doing these things. Always start with a demo. There's no need to explain anything. There's no need to say why you're doing it. Just show what you have. 80% of the audience will get it at this point, and the others will get it when you show the demo again. I tend to go from an example to generalization, so I start with a very concrete case, preferably the one that I think is the strongest application for what I'm doing. Hopefully that will convince people that it's useful. A demo video or an actual demo might help, and then during the talk I try to generalize and show the whole big thing. My personal goal is kind of to reduce, I said plan to abandon text. I mean, obviously I will not abandon text, but my goal is to reduce that, to minimize the clashing of people reading with listening. Another benefit is if people listen, they all hear the same information at the same time. So when John talked about telling a joke, if you tell the joke, people actually laugh at all at the same time or not. If it's painted on the slides, then everybody will get a different point, and you have some sort of a confusion about what's going on. And related work, I try to do in kind of an rapid serial visual presentation. So to focus people's attention, I use a couple of visual tricks. One of them is I tend to reserve black and white for actually highlight colors. So you might have noticed that my background is light gray and my font is dark gray, and so I can use black and white actually to highlight things. Sometimes I do tricks in Photoshop where I sharpen and blur things again to make sure that you're looking at the things I want you to look at, and to make sure you will find it easier to ignore things I don't care about. And I typically use one single highlight color, which then is the highlight color for everything, and if necessary I will change my pictures to reflect that color. And I will de-emphasize, crop, fade, matte, whatever, everything else in order to get like a minimalist slide deck that only contains the things I want to convey, to make sure that the slides do not distract from what I have to say. In order to make this happen, I start by taking very many pictures. So the most extreme is soap. You can see there's a scroll bar. I've got hundreds of photos of soap, and I took all these while I was working on the project, which is really important. Typically, if you give the talk and then you try to set out and take pictures of your prototype and screenshots and all these things, it's sometimes difficult to remember what exactly was going on. So I would encourage you to just take pictures of things that you're doing, of early prototypes early on, and just store them in some directory. And when time has come, you will be very happy that you have them. And I use image search if I can't come up with visuals from that. And I think the main thing, that's the last slide and the last picture, is be sparse. So that's kind of my goal for giving a presentation, is to have the least, like exactly the amount of content on my slides that's necessary, but not more than that. I'll be happy to take, this is...
Thank you, Patrick. Any questions?
It seems like both of you explained using visual aspects to slides, but what if your work doesn't have inherently visual aspects? Like you're talking about GUI, he's talking about maps. I do say, let's say I do theoretical computer science, right? You do algebra.
Yeah.
Or even that can be animated, but some things are not inherently visual.
That's a very good question, absolutely. So I think I mentioned this earlier. We're in a slightly better situation. I think John actually is the person who already talked a little bit to that by thinking about additional illustration you can draw from somewhere else. But absolutely, yes, making a slides for a theoretical talk is much harder, and I would be much less able of commenting on that and giving you advice. But I'll be very curious to see the slides that you have and discuss them. So obviously, like also Rick, who's going to talk after me, is in graphics, so it's also easy for him. Mary is also like in an interactive field, so all of us, in many ways.
response for that. I mean, I think you can still tell stories about your work, right? And any story is going to invoke visual imagery. So as long as you frame your work practically, you're always going to be able to come up with pictures for that.
Apart from that, had I organized this talk, and I'm kidding.
It's a real minor question, but I've encountered it myself. I noticed you use very low contrast, like in the bottom it says focused attention, and you can't always rely on projectors to show you that good contrast in the screen.
I kind of do, I have to say, yeah.
Test it out. 'Cause obviously it looks probably different on your laptop, right?
I have to say, like the last time I actually encountered a blown up projector, it's been a while. So recently, I think contrast is really high on these things. But as I said, obviously the gray thing, it's like I saw somebody, I think Bob Spence I saw who did that like 5 years ago, and I thought it was cool. Obviously it doesn't, as I said, that's a personal thing. That's the way I'm doing my talks right now. And if I give my talks in 2 years, then I'll use a different visual language. But I think overall, I mean, think about how you use emphasis. I mean, I see lots of slides where somebody puts a gradient in the back that goes from like 50% blue to 100% blue or whatever it is. And at this point, like the whole screen is already like glaring at me. Whatever you're going to put onto the slide now, I will not notice anymore. Like like you've wasted the biggest visual power by using for your background, right? And then people put like some decoration on the side, which is some generic artwork. It's okay to have, your Park logo or UW logo on the side. That's perfectly fine. But do you want to use the full dynamic range and make this like orange and blink? I mean, I'm exaggerating, right? Just think about what is like for the stuff that's redundant and understood. I think it should be something that uses a small amount of the visual channel, and the stuff that you actually try to communicate should be the thing that's outstanding on that slide, right? These are examples. I mean, everybody has a different visual language. I'm not claiming that this is the only one of doing it.
Well, I think we should get going.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Okay. How's that? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about visuals from a slightly different perspective. You'll notice that my visuals are somewhere in between John and Patrick's, and that I still do use lettering. And what I'm going to start off with is show you one of my sample talks. So let's see. So this is a talk that I gave at SIGGRAPH, or my student gave at SIGGRAPH last summer, and it has a lot to do about what you do with your personal photo collections. So how many of you here take a lot of digital photographs? Everyone? How many use cell phones? And how many people use regular point-and-shoot cameras or SLRs? Okay. Now what do people do with the photos? You've taken a lot of photos. What do you typically do with them after loading them to your PC? Any? Yes?
Upload them to Flickr.
Upload them to Flickr. So you're a Flickr user. How many Flickr users here? Okay. Well, that's good. People use email to share them. How many people print? Not that much. No, it's still, a lot of what photography is about today is about sharing. And if you go to a website like Flickr, so here's Flickr, and we're going to search for a particular term. So let's say you're interested in Rome and the Trevi Fountain. So you type something in like Trevi Fountain, and you look at all these results. There's a lot of photos here, right? And they're interesting, and this is, if you're a Flickr user, this is what you're normally faced with when you search for a topic. But it's a little hard to make sense of what it is you're looking for and what's in there. So in our system, what we've done is we take all of these photographs and we try to automatically organize them in a way that, so here it is again. Let's see. And on the next page, I want to show you how we visualize this. So here's what we do with the photos, is we take them and we organize them in 3D. We basically use computer vision techniques to tell you where all the photographs are laid out. And then if you want to see a particular viewpoint, all you have to do is go and click on that photograph and you'll see a detail. So what we're doing is taking this organized collection of photographs and then making them into a spatial organization. So here, let's say, I have a photograph in the middle that I want, and if I click on that, then it should just go and show you that particular photograph. Okay. Well, since that's not playing, I'm just going to continue with the talk. And, there it is. It's moving up. So there you go, and you zoom in on one of the photos. And then from there, you can navigate. I'll show you a little bit later on how you can find other related photographs.
So in terms of the system that I'm presenting at the talk, if I was giving the full talk, there's a scene reconstruction component, and that uses computer vision. And then there's a visualization component, which uses computer graphics and transitions. And it's based on a lot of related work. So here, the related work section, I use visuals, just like Patrick did. I think I like his idea of putting fewer on each slide. But people in computer vision and in computer graphics will be familiar with some of these papers. And then there's also stuff for multimedia, including things like geographic databases for photographs. And again, rather than showing you the complete talk, I'm going to just jump to 2 different topics in this latter phase. So I've skipped over a bunch of stuff. But how do we do navigation? So what navigation means in a system like this is, let's say you're interested in some detail, like this particular sculpture in the middle. Then what you might do is you might go there and highlight this particular photograph, and then see if you can find the photo. So let's say we do that. We go in here and highlight the photograph. What happens is, well, first we start with one photograph here by clicking on the frustum where the photograph was. And now if we're interested in a particular detail, what we do is, let's say we can select this part of the photograph and say, find me more photos of that particular object. So after we've selected it, the system goes and finds those particular photos, and it's doing it using computer vision techniques. And then if you want to see more details or more similar photographs, here you see a whole bunch of photographs of the same thing. And in the system, if you want to, for example, see a wider shot, then you can back up and see a wider shot. Here we are just flicking through the photos. And then you can say, well, give me a wider shot, and the system will step back and do that. So how does the system know, how does it know to find which photographs you're actually looking for? And the way it does it is it's basically using computer vision to do feature matching. So if you want to go from this blue square to this photo, what you do is you start with the photograph, and that photograph is associated with some three-dimensional points. You may have remembered there was like a point cloud. And what the system does is, for a given area, it finds the three-dimensional points in space, and it finds another photograph which has a good view on that point in terms of seeing the right amount of points filling up the viewpoint. And once it's found that, then it basically does a transition. And the way the transition happens is it uses this kind of rendering where what it's doing is it's crossfading between photographs. So what I'm going to show you here is, now we've put sort of a low-frequency translucent wash over the scene. We can navigate either by moving up here in the map view and say, put me, walk to this point on the overhead map, or we can do something like walk to a particular photograph, and now let's say we want to explore images to the left or to the right. It's just going to find the next photograph. So we have these kinds of cross-faded transitions, which is similar to what people in visual effects have been doing for morphing. So that's sort of the way you explore the system. The talk, usually you should have some sort of limitations in future work. So we show some of the failure cases and some ways in which it can be improved. Talk about some of the really challenging problems, like how we might reconstruct a whole city. Talk about something like this, where in the past what you saw was just transitions that were based on planes, and here we actually have a full 3D model underlying it. So I'm already in the part of the talk which is talking about future work, and I'm giving a preview of something that we're currently working on that hasn't been completely worked out. So I think that's where I'm going to stop. This would be the end of the sort of presentation at SIGGRAPH, and now let me sort of go back and in the last 5 minutes review what I just did. So let's analyze this talk a little bit to see what I did, right? The first thing was I started with a question. I mean, this is particularly effective when you have a small audience. It's hard to do it in a room of 1,000 people with the stage lights down. But if you're in a job interview, you're sitting in a room with 10 people, there's probably something you can just ask about the background. Like, you're a specialist in cryptography and you're at some computer department. You can say, how many people are crypto? How many are other parts of computer science, right? How many people have heard about this work that I'm being built on? And so right away you have some estimate of the audience, and you also have starting to establish some sort of rapport. Another thing which you'll notice, and what Patrick said, was start with a demo. So it's okay to show some results early on, even if the audience doesn't know how it was done, because you're going to have time in the talk to go back and explain it once they care. Of course, we all know about the importance of going back to sort of a structure so people know how far through the talk you are and what's coming up next. And you like to show, again, on this theme of telling stories, what's really good is if you can lead people along through the same development process that you did. In other words, you started with something simple, it sort of works, didn't quite work, so here's what we did. In other words, if there's a natural narrative, then people are interested. And they might be even thinking ahead of you a little bit and saying, I think I know some way of doing it better. and then you go ahead and do that. And if you can show some surprises, like this thing with the full 3D model at the end, was something that wasn't obvious from the talk, but you can sort of throw it in. So it's good to have sort of a modulation throughout the talk, and also leaving room for open questions. That's one of the purposes of having a future work slide, is to get the audience engaged in some sort of a discussion at the end of the talk. You really want them to have something to think about that they'd like to ask you. Visuals, using lots of pictures, using fewer words, we've gone over that. Animations, I've shown you how these work. So again, they shouldn't be gratuitous, but if you really get a sense of what's going on in the scene, then they're useful. Demos. So if I have something like a demo, then what I could do is just flip to the demo. Here's a demo that's already ready to run, so I don't have to do any fumbling. You just use Alt-Tab. And what I'm going to show you with this demo is something called the lens meter, which as you move the image around, as you move this little square around, you see how this image has a lot of different regions which have different exposures. So just in a single exposure, it's hard to capture it, but this is what's called high dynamic range imaging. And then just Alt-Tab back to your regular talk. So I'm going to skip over these talks, which were basically explaining what that demo was about. And I think I have 2 slides left. Spending enough time on your presentation is imperative, right? Most people spend a lot of time doing coding, more coding than research. And I know a lot of graduate students are very reluctant to do the writing. They usually leave that till the very end, and that's a mistake. But definitely spend a lot of time in your presentation, because what the people are going to see of your work is primarily they're going to see the talk. If you go to a conference, more people will see your talk than will actually read your work, than will actually talk to you about the research. And another thing, if you're ever nervous about giving a talk, rehearse in front of a friendly audience. Give a talk to only graduate students, people you have lunch with every day, people you play soccer with. It's a lot easier, then you can build outwards from that. And then in terms of the presentation, my preferred style is to face the audience and to use my laptop as the pointing device. Other people will point at the slide from time to time. I don't like that. On certain audiences, like in SIGGRAPH, where you've got a big camera facing on you, people are going to see the back of your head. So my particular style tends to be to stay close enough to my PowerPoint that I can basically do everything. And I don't have to glance at the slides to remember what to say, because I've got a little prompter, which is my laptop right in front of me. And be prepared to skip ahead, because that's what I had to do in this talk. So to summarize, basically, I think the most important thing is to convey some excitement about your work. So if you really, you put a lot of time and energy, that should show in your talk. As others have mentioned, details aren't important. Just getting people interested in the work is very important. This idea of throwing in extras, this is a trick I learned from other people like David Salson, as well in paper writing. If you sort of write the paper as the main story, and then somewhere near the end you say, well, now that we've presented what we're doing, here's a couple of embellishments that you can do with it. People feel like they're getting something extra for free. Keep it personal. If you know people in the audience like John or Patrick, mention them by name and mention how you really admire their work, right? And keep it open-ended so that people will want to ask questions at the end. And that's it.
Questions? Well, I have a question.
Thank you, John.
You do this incredible thing where you show an animation or a movie with no audio, and then you narrate it in real time.
Right.
And that's scary. Was it scary the first time you did that? Were you afraid of forgetting what you were going to say?
I mean, that generally is true for talks in general. As Patrick showed, once you've done this long enough, you can actually dispense with the words. There is one reason to put words on your slides, and that's for the people who've missed the talk and don't have the video. So it's your call. You can make... David Salson, who's a computer graphics person, has given SIGGRAPH talks with no words except for the title. And they're a delight to watch, but you don't get the talk. If you miss it, you have to read the paper. With the video, there's a lot of timing involved, because there are things that were sort of going on, and there was a narration originally, so you have to know your video. And actually today, I don't know if you noticed, but I stumbled a few times because the video wasn't coming quite as fast as I wanted it to, so I'd have to just make up words to wait until the video came in. So again, I think if you've rehearsed it a few times, you know your video, it's no different than narrating to photos. Yes?
Very first slide in which you have the title of the talk and the names of all your collaborators.
Right.
Do you actually read them out, or do you...
It really depends on, so the question for for people in the audience or who are listening from remotely, what you do in the first slide. I didn't do it today. Well, I only had my name. I very often put up pictures of people. It really depends. I think the right thing to do is to acknowledge your collaborators. I mean, often in a conference, it'll be the student who's presenting, so they'll say, you know, I did the work with the following people. Professors often present their students' work. So we had a symposium last week, and the professors would come up and they'd say, I'm going to talk about what is essentially Rob Fergus's work, right, acknowledging the person who did it. And, you know, we did it with these people. So, yes, I think it's very good. It also helps establish that personal thing, right? You mention the people by name. Some of these other names people know by reputation or so on. You could even tell a story. I mean, I didn't have time today, but in a small informal audience, a room of about 20 people, if I'm giving this talk, I'm going to say that the reason I did this phototourism thing is two of my biggest passions outside of work are travel and photography. And I've always wanted to organize that in a way that I can share with people. So again, any sort of thing that is personal before the talk as you're getting started just warms the audience up. And yes, so definitely acknowledge people.
Thanks, Rick.
Okay.
Okay, so last we have Mary Cherwinski, who is a research area manager for the Human-Centered Computing set of groups. And she just came here from exercising, so she should be either really energetic or really, really sleepy.
You
one or
put
the
me
other.
last so I could stop sweating.
Yeah.
How do we
get
get here?
this up here?
Good.
There we go. And it's this machine.
Good. Okay. Okay, this is what I do anyway. I figured since I was last, a lot of this would be covered, so I'm going to stay super practical. Exactly what I do when I get ready for a talk, that's what's in here. And you'll see I have a lot more text on my slides. I'm much less visual than the people who have come before, so maybe that'll give you an interesting taste of different styles and mixes. I think the most important thing by far is to actually have some really good, solid results to talk about, okay? That should be a given. But it kind of goes back to what John started out with, where if you throw too much stuff into a talk and it doesn't hold together and tell a really tight story, then you're going to run into trouble. So I kind of try to pick something that's a really solid result and tell a really neat story around that. I think that puts together a really good talk. And most important thing that job candidates tend to forget when they come out here is to have the practical implications of their work. Back to this fellow's question. You can be doing theory, but if you can't tell me why it's practically useful to Microsoft, let's just say, or to the world at large, it makes your talk all that much less interesting. And if you do make it practically useful and tell a story about it, then you can certainly come up with nice visual images and metaphors to use throughout your talk. So the next thing you have to worry about is once you've got your story and your interesting story to tell, an interesting research project, then you have to come up with some really neat content. You heard a lot of people say they go out and do web searches. You might look through your own image database. You might have pictures from your paper. But the main thing is to get permissions for anything you use. When I give keynotes, I always email the researchers that I'm pulling content from. So if I'm using a picture from their paper, I'll maybe have to email the ACM, maybe I have to email the author, but you have to get permissions to use some of those images. You should include key references. I love the visual way of doing that. That's fun. I've done that before. When I gave a large displays talk, I just used pictures of all the cool large displays. And that works really, really well. And then again, as I said, use a practical scenario to motivate the talk. And I like to talk at about the 50-foot level. You can always have a ton of backup slides at the end of your talk if people really want to drill down into details. But as you were seeing with the math, for instance, a lot of times if you just go overboard in terms of depth, you don't get to tell that nice high-level story. And people don't leave with the right takeaway message. So I like to talk about the 50-foot level. So preparing for the talk, you heard this from Rick. The most important thing is to practice. Oh, we heard it from John too. Practice, 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 especially for a job talk. Before you come out to a really good place to interview, go somewhere that's not so good and give your job talk. That's really important, actually. Give it to your friends. Give it to your lab. Give it to your professor. Give it over and over again. I love to give my job talks to the bathroom mirror. It's my favorite place. And like I said, cut down the slides to tell that really tight story. Only what you need to show, nothing more. Everything else, put in the backup, 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 backup. And then I took a couple power presentations courses, both when I was in product at Microsoft and then again later as a researcher. And the number one message they always hammer you with is to memorize the 7 plus or minus 2 key points that you're trying to impart to your audience. That's because your audience is going to randomize you. That's a given, right? They're going to start asking questions and they're going to have you going all over the map. They're going to make you jump ahead. They're going to make you go back. And you need to remember those pillars so that if you get pulled off topic, you have an anchor for getting back on track. And it also helps, as Rick was saying, to remind them of what you're actually trying to say. Here's my summary about what your slides should look like. Less text, smart graphics, not graphics just for graphics' sake, but smart ones that relate to the content. Honest charts. I think Patrick referred to this. Don't lie with your statistics. Follow good rules there. You should have a demo if you can. If you can't do a demo, I recommend a video. Videos are great. I use videos all the time. They say things clearly. There's a nice tight script. They say them slowly, maybe better than I would say them. Rick seems to be really good at it, but sometimes I think the video says it better than I would under pressure. And then subtle animation. I don't actually use animation between my slides, as you see, but if you can use animation to make a point, I think that's really important. As the speaker, this is the second thing I learned from power presentations. Tell them what you're going to tell them at the beginning of your talk. Tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Okay, so you just tell them over and over again so they get the message. And at key points in your talk, probably when you go back to the structure of your talk, say, are you all with me? Are you following me? Make that eye contact. Are people sleeping? Find out why. Say something to shake them up, especially 1:30 after lunch. Worst time to give a talk, and that's when a lot of job talks are, right? So, you just got to get in there and make it personal again. I like to project my voice and emphasize things so people can see I'm excited. And you got to speak energetically, but speak slowly enough so that people can understand what you're saying. If English is not your primary language and you've really been practicing this talk, you really want to speak slowly enough and articulate clearly so that the audience can follow you. And if English is your first language, I tend to speak so fast. Sometimes people say, God, could you please slow down? I can't hear what you're saying. So I have to watch that myself. Use your body parts. You got to use your eyes, your hands, your body. Move around. I really dislike it when people move up here and talk to their slides with their back to me the whole time. So like Rick, I think it's very important. You can be out here, but just don't use that as your speaking place. Use this as your speaking place. If you need to go up to a point in the, so let's say you've got charts or something, you need to emphasize something, that's fine. Figure out where it is and then go right to it and speak to the audience while you're pointing to it. Another thing I learned from power presentations is about good posture and balance. You should never be up here talking like this, especially not for a job talk. You should look really confident, square shoulders, balanced. Then you're not jerking all over the place. Even if you're really excited, like I get really excited, you're still kind of balanced. Here's the great one for power presentations, rude Q&A. When you work for Microsoft Research, let me tell you about rude Q&A. You get rude Q&A all the time when you give talks. Here are some lessons Corey Inkpen and I put together that I think you guys could really learn from. So, for instance, many of you have probably already used this tactic because it's an obvious one. If someone asks you a rude question, you want to buy some time. You don't know what to say. Say, let me repeat that and make sure I understand what you're saying. And the whole time in the back of your mind you're going, if there are multiple questions, and this happens all the time too, answer the very last one because you can remember that. That's in short-term memory. And then if you can remember the other ones, great for you, right? But if you can't, make the questioner re-ask the questions. Oftentimes they either forget, they ask a different question. Let's see. Ask for clarification of the question. That's another great way to buy time. Say, is what you're asking me actually this? What I'm saying here is you really want to get to the motivation of why they asked that question, especially if it's rude. So, are you asking me that because you're afraid Microsoft will, that kind of thing. Or you can do what the politicians do, ask a question back instead of answering the question. If it's too long of an answer, this is a veiled way of saying you don't know the answer. Say, oh, that's a really interesting question. It's a long answer. Can we take that offline? That gets you out. Tell a story by way of example. That's sometimes a really great and endearing way of answering a question and yet making it really personal. So say, oh, that's happened to me before. Here's how I dealt with that in my research or something. And always, especially when you represent a company or a university, be calm and humble but prepared for anything. So I actually ask people to ask me hard, rude questions when I give my practice talks, just to prepare for the worst. And so this is my last slide. So in conclusion, I think you just really have to love your topic. You have to have cool results to tell people. You have to be your prepared self, calm, humble, and prepared. Have fun, and think Stephen Colbert. Look, the guy's having fun up there, right? And he comes up with what he thinks because he's so well prepared, right? I think that's what makes it fun. And so you guys should be inspired by that. Thank you. Questions? Questioned out? That's such a bad sign at the end of a talk.
So you were talking about practice. Do you practice by yourself, or do you get people
I
to
do
listen?
a lot of practice by myself. I do a lot of practice while I prepare my slides. I practice, and then I see, oh, that doesn't sound right. Get rid of that, move that to the back.
That line, do you try to memorize or practice so that you memorize exact wordings, or do you just try to get the rough gist of it?
No, but I actually recommend for some of you, if you're nervous and you're worried that you're not going to be able to remember things to say, to go ahead and memorize. I've seen people do that to great effect. And that might not work if you get pulled off track. That might not work so well. It might be harder to get back into your memorized mode, but for certain people, it's worked really, really well, especially for really big venues where there are 2,000 people in the audience or something like that, and people aren't going to interrupt you anyway. Then memorizing's fine. I don't. I actually know this stuff so well now, for the most part, that it kind of flows. But no, I do a lot of practice before. I don't memorize.
I have a question
Yeah.
for everybody who's willing to be up there while I ask it, which is, like Rick mentioned prep time in terms of like putting together the slides, and I would guess, Patrick, that maybe your slides take the most time to put together because they're so crisp, but I don't know. Do you guys have a time value on that? I mean, is it a full week of work? Could you dedicate a full week of Microsoft research time?
The answer is yes,
like
you
a cigarette
can.
talk goes to 2,000
Sure you
people,
can.
right? So.
When you give a keynote, you better, right?
So I think I've never done it until recently. I actually made the slides after I submitted the paper. That's perfect, because then everything's completely fresh in your memory. You know exactly what you were thinking. You just dump all the figures from your paper into a slide deck and start working on it, and you get it done in half the time it would normally take you. That seems, except from the fact that I'm completely worn out usually, so I never do that by the time I submit the paper, but that's a good time saver.
Yeah, but for keynote talks that you're coming up with from scratch, it takes a week. It takes a long time. I actually dread doing those because it takes so long.
How much time do you usually spend on a conference talk?
Conference talk?
Making the
That's
slides, you mean,
faster.
right?
Yeah, making the
That's
slides.
faster.
And rehearsing too, probably.
Yeah.
For me, it's one day about.
Wow. It's longer for me.
Less for me, like 4 hours maybe.
I'd say about a day for the first draft, but
Yeah.
then we'll be revising it for about a week, I'll spend an hour here, an hour there.
I'm still doing it on the plane.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. No, my question actually is for all of you pretty much, but like on and off, everybody is discussing conference talks, job talks. Can you just give a quick overview of like what should be different between the two? Obviously there's a huge difference in audience and everything else, right? What do you think the talk should be different?
Sure. The two obvious differences are a conference talk is a collection of specialists generally, right? So you're talking to people who have much more background. A job talk invariably is a university department or Microsoft research, so you're talking to everyone in CS, right? The other thing is, especially with a company, knowing more about what things might be interesting to the company is important, and that helps focus your talk. In the conference, you have to know what is considered novel and exciting for that research. It's very different what is interesting to a research community, which is maybe depth in a particular area, versus what's interesting to a company, which is, of course we want depth, we also want applicability, so you have to relate it and this stuff would be important because our search algorithms can run much faster, that kind of thing. So those are two thoughts.
Another one is like in a job talk, you tend to emphasize. Sometimes you talk about multiple topics. There's different layouts that you can do. Sometimes people talk about their whole agenda, then they mention like 2 or 3 projects, and then they go into one project in depth, right? Which is somewhat different from a conference talk, which is just, you know, you have like 30 seconds, I mean, depending, like a really brief moment of introduction because everybody's an expert, you go in, blah, 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 you come out and you're done. And in a job talk, it's a little bit more of touching multiple bases before you actually, but then typically like the last like 20, 30 minutes or so is like one deep topic. The other thing that's different about job talk is it's kind of a hidden transaction. Like on the top visible layer, you're talking about your work, right? But the subliminal message is hire me. Right? So it's like, you know, somewhere in the corner says, yeah, best paper award or something, you know, like normally you wouldn't be kind of too humble to say that, but in a job talk, you know, it might be okay to kind of, it's kind of this borderline between being humble and, you know, fulfilling the mission while you're there, right? So,
well, job talks or just talks in smaller venues, right? Because you might go through job talks for a period, but before you do that, actually, one piece of advice is that there is some way to arrange going to give talks at a university before you're on the job market. That's extremely helpful because you will get that circle. You know, I did this once or twice before I graduated. You will spend a day talking to various students and faculty members and having that comfort level of, well, what's your specialty, what your area of specialty?
Mine?
Yeah.
Real-time systems.
Real-time systems, right? So you might go give a talk about real-time systems, but, you know, just to fill out your days, there's not that many specialists. They might also put someone that has to do with, you know, security at the OS level. They'll put some other systems people on your schedule. And walking into an office and finding out what they do and seeing whether there's any overlap with your stuff, that's another skill. That's really more not about giving the talk, but about going through the interview process and building connections. That's so important for any interview, is talking to people who aren't in your specialty. Because people are basically looking for collaborators, right? The people who make the hiring decision at a university department are the faculty as a whole, and your advocate, the person who wants to hire you, is just one voice. So you have to convince the other faculty that they want you as a colleague.
Related to that, in a job talk, you probably have a good idea of who's going to be in the audience. So if they've done related work, you better mention it in your talk.
This may not happen so much in conferences, but do you have any tips for how to deal with questions that come during your talk that maybe are distracting from the issue? Or
Well, you can always defer it if you know you're going to be addressing it later. If you aren't going to be addressing it later, you're going to have to just deal with it calmly. And again, you can use some of those tactics for your rude Q&A to maybe, you know, get into it a little bit. But then you have to try to remind yourself how you're going to get back on track, right? That's a skill. That's from practice. If you keep practicing and practicing, that'll get easier and easier.
But I mean, in general, especially if you're not trying to cram too much in, it's nice to load up your talk with less material, or at least less material you really feel like you need to get into, because it's those tangents that you weren't expecting, which in small settings are sometimes the most interesting things. So if it's something that interests you, you should welcome the question and say, let's go into that a little bit. I may have to skip things later on, but if you as an audience are interested in this topic, let's spend a few minutes on it, right? Whereas if you really don't know anything about it or it's uninteresting, you say, you know, actually, it's a great question, but it's not something I've been working on, or whatever. You can do that.
I tend to encourage people before I start to actually ask questions. I think it makes the talk more interesting, and on the high-level perspective, I guess, if questions are asked, that demonstrates that there's interest, which I enjoy while I'm giving the talk. And, you know, I think if that was a job talk, the fact that everybody sees it, you know, even like the theory person who might not be so interested in the HCI stuff I'm talking about, if they see that there's actually something, you know, interaction happening, that's a good sign. I think, again, it depends a little bit on how long you've done this. So the first time I was, you know, I had like a higher profile, full professor, like drill down like with difficult questions. I was really like, whoa, why is he at my case or so? And if you get a bit more experience, you start actually appreciating the fact that people have these questions and that it's not, you know, it's actually a good sign. All questions are a good sign, I think. Almost, like 95%.
I think actually in a smaller venue, again, this is when I go talk sort of at the departmental, the small room as opposed to a conference, I'll usually say somewhere near the outline of the talk saying, by the way, I welcome questions at any point. I'm happy to stop and go in deeper. Because you don't have to get through the whole thing, right?
Maybe along these lines, in many, I just had a discussion about how to write papers, and I think the key element of speaking is it's in many ways it's about the audience, not you, right? You already know the stuff that you've done, right? So in many ways you're there because they expect to find something interesting in your stuff. So if they ask questions, that's exactly what you hear. It's not about you getting through your stuff, it's about them getting something out of your talk. So in many ways, them asking questions is the top priority. This is why you're here. And I think that's a big principle for everything you do. If you, this by itself is a long topic, but if you came up with your work in order X, Y, and Z, and you went through all these different branches that ended up not being interesting, or the fact that you got it based on EU funding or whatever, all these things are things you can easily skip in a talk because you're there, because they are curious about what you got out of it. And so at the end of the talk, they should have something that applies. Ideally, they go back and say, wow, I've got this idea for this follow-up project. Everybody in this room ideally would cite your work because they will be inspired to do something with it. So you should, when you make your slides, you should think about all those things that you think are interesting to them. And especially if you know the people, because you've been traveling, you've talked to people before, you can put in references and connections so that they will actually get more out of your talk. That will make it interesting.
The thing about knowing people reminds me, if you, as a graduate student, people come give talks to your university from other universities, get on their calendars, talk to them, right? It's usually people who are coming for a visit have time on their calendar to meet with some faculty and some students. So if you think there's something interesting, and you've got something to talk about, get to know these people because, when I was interviewing for my first time out of PhD for graduate school, I basically wanted to go to the place where I already knew the professors from conferences, and I knew they wanted me to come there. So those connections are important.
Well, just following up on what Rick just said, I sometimes get this when friends of mine or former students or so, they send me email like, I just graduated, how do I get a job in the Microsoft? Obviously it's not relevant for you because you're already here, you're all going to interview here, you're all going to get a job here. but if you feel like you're getting ready, like using this, the typical thing I tell people when they talk to me a little earlier is that, how about you just swing by sometime and give a talk? How about next time you're somewhere in this hemisphere, go the extra mile and if not, just pay the flight and pretend to be here accidentally, give a talk to people, and that makes everything so much easier. And do it a couple of months before you graduate, because if you have graduated, then it's very clear that you're here to find a job. If it's a couple of months before, it's a nice way of, go to as many conferences as you can, meet people, and make sure that people know who you are. This will lower the bar substantially by the time that you're looking for an
I did have one question I wanted to ask the audience, namely the interns here. Who's given a talk in front of what I would call a large audience, let's say 800 people or more?
Like 100 or 200 people.
Right. So, any tips from your experience?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to think, okay, this is going to be a really large crowd, and then you walk out there and you're just like, oh my God, this is it. So you kind of have the crazy, okay, deep breath. But being prepared and remember that you're there because you want to be. This is supposed to be stuff that you like doing and talking about. So, just try and remember to keep that excitement when you're staring at 800 faces.
Right. And any other tips from the thinkers themselves? You've heard stuff today. Any tips to your fellow students?
I'm talking about the presentation itself, the visual aspects. I've noticed that you said that projectors are pretty good these days at showing contrast, but the projector is not the only variable. I mean, in hotel rooms and conference rooms have different lighting and different settings, and even if the projector is the best, it may not look as crisp everywhere. So I guess the best way is to have the maximum amount of contrast as possible, so that, okay, it shouldn't be like bright yellow and black so that it hurts your eye, right? But what do you want to point out, how the maximum amount of contrast on that highlights something?
I just had one comment regarding memorization. So if you're nervous about the talk, it can help often to memorize your first 2 slides, just so that you're confident that you can get into the talk. And then you can start to be a little bit more flexible and sound more real rather than memorized.
So in response to Rick's question, one advice I got previously was imagine that you're just in the field of carrots. You're not people, but carrots. So you feel less pressure. The other thing is just you go up, remember to smile, and that will kind of calm you down and continue.
Yeah, along those lines, the smiling, there were all sorts of psychological studies that if you smile at people, they'll smile back, right? And so they just naturally like you, and you're all smiling right now. And along those lines, to help you smile, maybe not carrots, but the best piece of advice I ever got was just picture them all in their underwear. And whenever that guy is asking you the really rude Q&A, you just grin. And it helps you remember that, maybe he's not attacking you, it keeps you grounded.
Security will escort you out.
So one thing that I found maybe in smaller audiences, this kind of relates to what Patrick was saying about questions. I mean, it's true that you're there to answer questions and you should know your audience, but I've also found that it's good to keep in mind that you're the boss, you're the expert in the room, and just to have that, not to be cocky about it, but just to know that, you can dictate the pace a little bit, you can move things along, and you can deflect, and people aren't going to think you're being rude because you are running the show, and that I found can be helpful if you do feel like you're lost and people are pulling you away. Just keep in mind that you're on stage and you're in front and you're standing up and everyone else is sitting there watching you.
I have a question. Pretty much. I mean, again, all of you. So, future work, right? I mean, different venues, different amounts, different depths, details. Any thoughts? How much you put on what?
I like Rick's idea of, oftentimes people get to talk and I think their system is, cake. There's no problem with their system. And they don't expose the weaknesses or the challenging issues that emerge or the surprises of good stuff. And so I really like it when you end with a series of surprises or things that you know are wrong and why. And so I could take a couple slides, actually, to walk through. A lot of people just do one slide for future work and give it short shrift. And I think it's actually more interesting than that.
One of the coolest presentations I've seen was Michael Cohen, and I don't know exactly what the venue was. He was showing Group Shot, which is a tool that allows you to take a stack of pictures and to pick different faces from different shots to combine them into one group shot to get a really nice shot. And he just said, well, we made this thing and we don't really know how to design the user interface. And like in hindsight, I mean, looking at the system is extremely good. And I mean, I would say like 70% of the people who claim to be ACI people would have done a much worse job than that. So it was already very good. But just the way of saying, well, here's a question I'm thinking about, not quite clear how to do that, really like opened up the discussion, and I think everybody got more out of it. And I think that seems like a really good way of spending the last couple of minutes of the talk to come up with a couple of, not so much of like this is what I plan to do as next, but wondering if this could apply here, could be combined and like maybe even if you have already a little bit of an answer to it, but give other people the joy of finding out. Okay, so I think we'll stop now, because we've been here a while, but thanks all you carrots in your underwear for coming.